everyone. Welcome back. The next talk is by Jonathan called You Wouldn't Download a Debian Developer. So give a warm round of applause to Jonathan.
Thank you, everyone. A bit of an unconventional talk, especially for DPL. But I thought, I thought of having a talk looking into the future a bit, because in Debian we're very good at insight. That's looking at current problems and understanding it and taking it apart. We're also somewhat good at hindsight, where we look at the past and look at what went wrong. But when it comes to foresight, looking into the future, planning ahead, we're kind of a bit incoherent. And as DPL, one of the pieces of feedback I get often is that people want more planning, more thinking ahead, more vision. And I think part of that can come from the DPL, but I think we need to work together to make that more part of Debian's DNA as much as the first two parts in that list is. So I thought of making this talk very easygoing on especially newcomers in Debian, which no one here is, but not only newcomers, but non-technical people, because some of the things we need to communicate to people are very complicated, and we need to kind of break it down into simpler ways to explain so that our users can also start fighting our battles for us. So I'm going back all the way to 1993. This happens to be the year that Debian was founded, but I was completely oblivious about it back then. I was 11 years old and in school one day, and our science teacher was sick, so we had a substitute science teacher that came in, and he was very full of himself, this guy. He was an expert on anything you could imagine. And he said instead of doing science, a normal science class today, he's going to let us ask him anything about science, the universe. He'll give us an answer. He knows 10, 11-year-olds. There's nothing we can ask that he can't answer. So the one girl in the class asked, what's the next big thing in tech? What's going to fundamentally change our lives in the years to come? Because she wanted to be an engineer when she grows up. So the teacher said, basically nothing. And at this point I get that little itch that I want to start an argument with someone, as I'm sure many of you will be familiar with that itch. So I was just thinking of a new computer we got at home. It was fantastic. You could do 256 colors at 640 by 480 or 16 colors at 800 by 600. And compared to the computers I knew before this, like a little ZX Spectrum or an XT with monochrome screen, this was amazing. And I thought, if we made this much progress within a few short years, what's the chance that it's actually going to stop? It's probably going to go slower or the same or faster, but I don't think it's going to stop. So I started an argument with this teacher, and he hated me ever since then. Because how dare someone question his huge pool of knowledge. And he doubled down and said, nothing's ever going to come along. It's never going to happen that something is going to change our lives as much as technology has in the decades before then. So I couldn't immediately think of an example to counter him, so I let it go. And some more years went by. 5 years later, I was 16 years old. I was in electronics class, and something similar happened in our class then. Our teacher said we're ahead of schedule. And we can ask him anything about the future of electronics or electronics that we've covered in our course so far. And the one kid in my class said that his father predicts that all TVs in the future will be widescreen. And my teacher said, no, it's not going to happen. And again, I think of the last 5 years that have transpired. Suddenly you have cell phones. We had dial-up internet, which was slow, but it still had a profound impact on our technology, changed our life. I told him about what my previous teacher predicted and how quickly things have changed and escalated since then. But then he also doubled down. He said, nope, it's never going to happen. All of the broadcasters would have to get on board. VCRs would have to be changed. TVs would have to be rebuilt. There's just no way to do this without footing a huge bill. that no one will ever want to pay for. But another 5 years went by, and suddenly it was very clear that that exact thing was happening. All the broadcasters were advertising that they're getting ready for HD and starting broadcasting in HD and digital formats. Plasma and LCD TVs started to become cheaper and cheaper. And it was clear that just in this very short time, this change was going to happen. And it's an example of just how quickly something can change, even when you work with technology and think that things are going to stay the same for a long time. At this point, our one family of a friend, an old lady, she taped everything that was on TV. And one day I innocently made a remark that, one day she wouldn't have to record everything that's on TV, because she literally had a whole room stacked with VHS tapes in her house. And I was just telling her, in the future she probably wouldn't need so much space for all these tapes, because technology is going to improve, and there'll be better ways to store this, and she might not even need to store anything at all. And she took this very offensively, because she was so emotionally invested in a technology that she treated me differently for weeks after this, because how dare I basically insult her VHS collection, which was not my intention, but it was just a matter of fact at that point. But then in 2008, another 5 years later, I was working for a Linux company that works for large corporates and for government. And me and my boss were driving to a client one day, and I told him that we should really look at Android, because it looks very interesting, and it's something that we're kind of ignoring at the moment. And he said that the thing is with phones and mobile, it's all about the ecosystem, and nothing's ever going to upset Microsoft's powerful ecosystem. And licensing for Windows Mobile is really cheap, so licensing costs isn't really an issue. So it's really unlikely that Android will ever upset the mobile market that much. So at this point, I could almost accept it, but he basically then also said, it's never going to happen. And as soon as someone says that, never, it kind of triggers me. So this is a few stories, but just in summary, I try to not do too much stuff by PowerPoint. Some people who sound very clever and are very confident about the predictions of the future actually has no idea what they're talking about. This is a theme that's recurring in my life. Things can change very fast. We make assumptions and get stuck into certain ideas about things have always worked, now it will work. And the fact is that things not only change, but they do very, very fast. Predicting what's going to happen next is always tough. I think all of us here have made wrong predictions in the past as well. And people become invested in their technology, emotionally invested. Even if you use something for a long time, you get a relationship with it. And why I made the last one in bold is we get this in Debian as well. People use the term never way too liberally in Debian. So fast forward all the way to 2022. In the beginning of 2022, I was up for DPL re-elections, where I had to decide whether I want to run again. And the one factor that made me think of running again is last year was very tough. There's a bunch of things I wanted to do that didn't work out, mostly because of things being postponed for the release. Being DPL in a release year is actually kind of tough, because it's difficult to push things and make things happen. But it's also a bit easier because you need to learn how to take a bit of a backseat. So I actually think it might be good for a good cycle for DPLs to be the first year in a release year, just to settle in, and then take the second year to maybe take more actions. And then we also have kind of TikTok model, but that's for another discussion. The big technical issue I wanted to focus on for this year, because is firmware. I think it's the biggest problem in free software and open source at the moment, and it doesn't seem like too many people are doing something about it. And In Debian, I think we're in a good position to actually take some action. So I'm going to explain a little bit. I know everyone here will probably know most of what I'm explaining, but the idea is that we also get collectively better at explaining this to the end user. So Wikipedia is this very nice description of what firmware is. I was going to read it originally, but nah. I think most of you have read it that by now. It's a very good description, but if you don't know what firmware is, this isn't actually going to help you understand better what firmware is. If I explained this to my mother, she would just say, and that would be it. So, but let's talk a bit about the history of firmware. So, this was our family's first printer, one very similar like this. Its firmware is very basic. It's all written on a little ROM that's soldered on the board. It has a bunch of built-in fonts, and without it even being plugged in the computer, you can press a button while turning it on, and it will print a nice test page so that you know your printer is working. Very basic firmware. If you wanted to change it, you had to physically solder out the EEPROM, write a new one to a new chip, and solder it back on. So no one ever updated the firmware on these, at least not an average consumer. Then some years later, this was my first CD writer device. It worked okay for the most part. Now and again a disk bombed out, and I thought it was because my computer was slow. But then I read on the internet that I could update the firmware on this device and it would be more stable. And I did it, and it was. And this was kind of mind-blowing because this was the first time I saw a consumer device where you could update the firmware of something at home without having to go through all the effort of taking your drive out of the computer, taking it to the shop, letting them handle some recall or something like that. And this was quite good. It's good for the consumers, it's good for the manufacturers, it saves everyone time and money. So I think firmware updates as a whole has been good, good since then, or at least, yeah. The next thing I had that had new type of firmware was this printer. It's a Lexmark 1020. How it works is every time you print to it, it basically sends the firmware to the printer as well. So this means that the user doesn't have to ever think of updating firmware or loading firmware. What happens is that the driver contains the firmware and it sends it to the printer every time. So the worst that can happen is if there's botched firmware is you switch the printer off and back on again, and it will load the new firmware fine and probably work fine as well. So this saved a lot of costs. It was also good, except when you used Linux back then, because the Linux drivers back then didn't know about firmware or sending it to a printer, and there was no way available to make these easily work on Linux. So they effectively became paperweights, and this was kind of the start of firmware becoming a problem on Linux as well. There was also, these ended up being called Win printers, and there were also Win modems, which had a similar problem at that time. So, lessons learned from my crappy hardware in the 90s. Firmware has changed a lot during the 90s. It started from immutable ROMs built into the machines, all the way to things that actually get only written to RAM on the physical device. But since then, things have become quite a bit more complicated even. So we fast forward all the way back again to a little more than a month ago. Earlier this month. Sorry, what is the date? earlier this month, yeah, 3 weeks ago. I was just busy starting to think of what the outline for this talk would be, or even if I should give this talk. And right as I still was deciding whether I'll have time to even prepare my slides, we had this big news that NVIDIA is releasing a free graphics driver for Linux, and this was very exciting. I saw posts about this everywhere, and I even saw on another post that this helps the Nouveau developers in some ways, and I thought, okay, that's great. And I thought I should look into it some more because they talk about drivers, but there's no mention of firmware. And I thought, I wonder where firmware comes in, because Obviously, if it helps Nouveau, they should have some firmware somewhere. And I made a mental bookmark to go look into it sometime. But then 12 May happened. When I woke up, I saw this tweet from Asahi Linux. They're the people who work on enabling Linux support on MacBooks. So they know a lot about firmware and how to work with it. And Hector Martin, who's a lead developer, said, so NVIDIA released their kernel driver as open source, by which they mean they moved most of it to firmware and made the open source driver call to it. There are almost 900 functions implemented in the 34 megabytes of firmware, give or take, from what I can see. So, yeah, started to look not as good as we hoped, but he went on further to say, and I can't read it on my previous screen. For reference, Apple's GPU firmware is 400 kilobyte. Apple's display controller, which is similarly insane, RPC mess is 7 meg, but most of that is data tables, about 1.5 megabyte of code. Don't get me wrong, less blobs in the kernel is great, but open source their driver, they did not. So eventually, make some good points, but the question at the end is, is this a licensing hack? NVIDIA wasn't allowed to use GPL. They couldn't link to the GPL kernel directly. So fundamentally, does this make a philosophical difference? Are we in a better case after this happened than before? And I think that's an interesting question. But one thing is for certain is that what we call firmware has become significantly and exponentially more complicated than what it was in the 90s. It's not just some tiny blob that just initializes a piece of hardware. It contains drivers and operating system code and much more complicated things that was the few kilobytes that we used to think of firmware as about. I'm sure everyone here knows about Intel Management Engine. On Intel boards made in the last bit more than a decade, if you use an Intel CPU, your motherboard runs Minix on it somewhere. It's the most popular operating system on desktops in the world, and people don't even know it. So when your board's firmware running a whole operating system, things have gotten a lot more complicated. About 2 months ago, I also updated some firmware on hard drives, and the last time I updated a hard disk firmware, about 3 years ago, it was just about a megabyte for the disk's firmware, and I already thought that's quite large for a hard disk, because a few years ago it was also about 100 kilobytes, so it's a huge jump in size. But this time I downloaded the hard disk firmware, and it was about 12.5 megabytes, and I couldn't help but wonder, what does this firmware do? I couldn't find out. My best guess is that perhaps it's some encryption stuff if you don't want your host to know what's going on your disk, and you'd rather lose the data than someone else get it. Or maybe it runs Linux on the disk as well. Anything is possible these days. But again, things are clearly becoming a lot more complicated. So just in a nutshell again, your computer is basically becoming this network of non-free computers, and you can install Debian on your machine, but that will be one operating system running on part of one of the CPUs you have. And in the end, it comes back to that question: is what's the effect of this? What do we still consider our computer free if that's the case? I went to forward to that one. And what's the decisions we need to make because of that? So some decisions we can't wait before talking about anymore, because as always, things move fast and things escalate fast. Personally, I always install from the free disk. I saw a lot of people say on the list that always install from the firmware disk because it's easier. But in my case, I always installed from the free Debian image, and then usually just install the IWL driver for Wi-Fi. And then at least I knew exactly what non-free stuff is installed on my machine. And because I selected and installed it, there's no surprises that come along the way. But then I bought this cheap Chinese laptop that I'm doing my talk on at the moment. And This came with a nasty surprise when I booted it up with the Debian installer netinst image. I just got a black screen and couldn't progress from there. So this means for the first time I needed to use the non-free disk to actually be able to boot up the installer on my machine, which was quite sad, but it gets even worse because I work often with students who install Linux on their laptops, and more the new laptops that are coming out just doesn't have Ethernet ports because the typical consumer just doesn't care about them at all. Because what I do in the past is I'd install my system via CD or netboot and install drivers over Ethernet later on that someone might need. But more and more, this is becoming not possible either. So we get to a point where if we want people to be able to install Debian on physical laptops or desktops, sometimes server 2, we need to install from physical media that contains non-free firmware, which puts us in a difficult position because I'll get to that later. But first, what are others doing about this? So there's this one project called the Linux Vendor Firmware Service. They don't care about booting so much or getting your system installed, but they care about keeping your firmware up to date. So the idea is you install FWUpd, and it has some GNOME and KDE UIs with it as well. So you'd get a pop-up on your screen saying that this firmware on your system is out of date. Do you want to download it? And then it goes and downloads it from LVFS. And it's all built in UEFI, so it will reboot your computer, update the firmware, and then reboot your computer back into your operating system. So what's significant about this is the last few lines, where they basically say that having your firmware in LVFS has become so critical that if your organization or hardware vendor doesn't do it, it basically makes it a non-starter for your organization. So about 99% of hardware manufacturers now have firmware in there, and the few outliers are also slowly coming to the party as well. So that's for the most part a good thing. At least we can now on Linux update firmware when necessary. We don't have to run old insecure code. And then what is the Free Software Foundation and OSI doing about it? Open Source Initiative is doing very little as far as I can tell. I looked over the last 10 years, they co-signed one letter where they said non-free firmware for Wi-Fi cards is kind of bad, and that's all I could find for the last decade of OSI, which is not very motivating for me. And I thought, what's the Free Software Foundation doing? And similarly, Richard Stallman complains a lot about non-free firmware, but that's where it ends. In his last talk at LibrePlanet, someone in the audience asked him, what can we as free software advocates do about non-free firmware and to improve the situation? And he said, well, you can donate money to organizations that fight for free firmware, like the Free Software Foundation. And I thought, yeah, but the Free Software Foundation isn't actually doing anything. So I don't know. I'm a bit frustrated with both of them for not taking more action and taking this more seriously, because I think someone should. And I think it should be organizations like they. So then that asks a question like, what can we do? What can we do in Debian? And the point that I almost skipped to just now is I still believe in Debian free software guides and a social contract. I think it's the most important part of Debian. If we don't have that, then we might as well use Ubuntu or SUSE, because this is really what makes Debian for me. The fact that we put building a good operating system before profits, that we don't have Debian-specific agreements with organizations. Anyone can take our work, run with it, build something cool on it, and it's not a problem for anyone. That's fundamentally important to me. So how do we improve the firmware situation for our users in 2022, in 2024, without breaking the DFSG and social contract? So we've had some discussions on the list about this recently. Steve McIntyre, who I've talked to a lot about this over the last year, initiated some discussion about this on Debian Devel. I think it's fairly non-controversial to split out firmware into non-free firmware. That means if we make a disk where firmware is enabled by default, at least they don't get the whole non-free along with it. So, but also the split out itself is quite easy because we just it doesn't affect our freedom at all or have a huge technical difficulty behind it. Then a next step after that could be to make the disk that has firmware on easier to find, so that you have our free image next to the non-free image. That text is a bit difficult to read. It says contains non-free firmware required for many network adapters and graphic cards. Read more. So the idea is that we use our download page to as a platform to campaign for what non-free firmware is about, or what the effects is for users, so that at least if they download that, it's instead of just having non-free firmware on all the disks, they can start understanding what this is about and maybe help campaign for us, or at least make better hardware decisions when they buy hardware in the future, because maybe you'll have one network card that doesn't require non-free firmware, but another does, and they'll think, oh yes, wait, I want to run Debian, let me get that one instead. But these are two maybe somewhat easier, lower hanging fruit stuff we could do. What after that? We still have all the same problems we do, even if we go ahead and do that. So here's a bit more dev by PowerPoint. We do have lots of funds, so maybe we could fund some reverse engineering. On Debian Devel, someone was convinced about 2 years ago that it's possible to spend about $100,000 and reverse engineer at least a network card driver. I'd be very happy if Debian pays for something like that. I don't know how everyone else feels about it, but I think anything we can do to help make this problem better is good. I mentioned Kickstarter campaigns to produce new GPUs or new entire machines. It would be a lot more what's the word I'm looking for? Optimistic a few years ago to try something like that. Ambitious is a word. But these days, with the RISC-V ecosystem starting to flourish, maybe in a few years it would be easy to get something started where either we or someone else starts making nice RISC-V laptops with entirely free firmware on it, and we tell them, if you want to use a completely free Debian, at least you can use this hardware enabled to do that. Then the other option is I put question marks after all of these because I'm not saying this is what we should do. These are just some possibilities that I thought of some late night during this week. We could also do the Free Software Foundation and OSI's work for them if we need to create press kits explaining why free firmware might actually be good for the vendor. And maybe at least we can convince them to give some specifications out, even if they don't make the driver open source. We can say, well, you know what, you can have, we can help find someone who can make a free driver if you just give us some specifications, and we can work together to make this possible. But also this is something I think we should continue to discuss and take further, and we talk about things like this often during the DPL elections, and then the rest of the time it kind of goes quiet a bit. But I'd like us to keep this discussion going and get some ideas that we can actually implement. So what does the future of Debian hold further than that, thinking ahead to next year, the year after that, going on all the way into the end of the next decade? We'll skip what happens after this. I think the strategy for many people I've met in Debian so far is to this is our retirement date, and whatever happens after that is someone else's problem. So back to 2022. Currently we have about 70,000 packages in Debian, but in other archives there exist lots of other packages. There's about 18,500 packages in CRAN, and there are packages, like so often 10 of them in a day, and just uploads them to Debian. There's more packages in Rust than there is in Debian. I don't know exactly how this is counted. I mentioned this to someone this week and they asked me how is this counted, and I said, I need to go check, and I haven't yet. There's 108,000 in CPAN and 350,000 packages in Pipey. Although, and I mean this in the non-meanest way possible, but there's a lot of junk in there too. But even taking that into account, I think looking ahead towards the end of the next decade, we need to prepare for the possibility that we might need 1 million packages in Debian if we want to continue packaging all the nice free software that's busy being built out there, because that's still escalating at an increasing rate, the amount of software people are writing. And yeah, so I was thinking, yesterday I looked at Agath's talk about ITP dependency tracking, and I thought, that looks like a lot of work for something that usually takes me about a minute or two to figure out by hand for a package, and for the few things I upload, it looks like a lot of work. But then I realized as time goes by, we're going to need tools like that more and more, because things are going to get more and more complicated. There's going to be more dependencies that need more dependencies that need more dependencies. And I think it's great that someone's actually thinking about that and writing tools for that. Jalmer's Janitor inspired the title of a talk, because I think we need to find ways to make packages less work. I don't think the human touch will ever go quite away, but already today the janitor is saving thousands of hours of work every year. Stuff that I thought I won't do because I don't think it's always worthwhile, and maybe I'm bad for doing that. Stuff like adding the upstream metadata to my packages. I thought I'll do that sometime when Lentian starts complaining about it, but otherwise I won't bother. But then Janitor started doing all that for me, and that's awesome. I think lots of boring, repetitive tasks can be done by a bot instead. And then Phil talked a lot about OpenQA. Roland talked a lot about it as well. That's a great tool. We can smoke test more things, find problems, stop finding problems at the last minute. And also, I'm actually kind of skipping ahead because, yeah, let me just see. Can we automate? I was thinking about FTP master as well. Most of the packages I've sponsored and reviewed for other people. Just doing a grep RI copyright finds most of the issues that cause rejects by the time it gets to FTP master. So I was thinking we should do what Janitor does for packages. We need something like that for FTP master as well, because rejects are a lot easier than accepts. It's quite easy to find something in a package that can cause it not to be accepted by FTP master. And if we can just reduce the number of packages that FTP master manually has to review, that could help a lot. So I want to talk to Jalmer at some point and figure out, can we get something for FTP master at least to get some automated reject system. And even if the bot finds a false positive, there should be some button that says, I don't agree with the bot, and then it just go back to its position in the manual review queue anyway. So at least it shouldn't have any downsides for anyone. So things that also need to scale is all these things: dpkg, apt, archive, our processes, our community. Either that, or we have to ship less, or we have to make a reduction in quality, or supplement Debian packages with app images. I don't use app images much, but for the few things I do, they're actually quite great. And for unstable software like Firefox, for example, it's just impossible to ship Firefox in stable. I'm not happy about that, but it's a fact that we can't change at this point. And if I would use app image for something like Firefox for one of my users, I would rather have it being built on Debian infrastructure and maybe even distributed using our normal tools like apt and updated via that. I'm not even sure if that's possible. Also, why it has a question mark, and I don't know how other people in Debian would feel about that. Maybe it's just a wishlist item that will never happen. But there are some edge cases where Debian packaging isn't quite perfect for. So is it possible to have it all? Free firmware, all the free software world, unstable releases with updates. It's a lot. It's a big ask that we do. I mean, even when Debian was founded, people didn't really know that this was going to work out. And we're kind of at the point we're at the next level to figure out if we can, how to make our goals work for the next decade or so and past that. But I do think it's worth a shot. We should try to have it all, and I'm against the idea of giving up and just including non-free firmware and all our media and calling it a day, because I think we can do more to get free hardware out there, to get existing manufacturers to consider free firmware, and yeah, let's see how far we can push this inside of Debian. So because we have 10 minutes left in this talk, we can discuss a little bit if you want, if you have questions or comments. But also, I'm going to start regular Jitsi calls on this. The first one is on Tuesday, 7th of June. We'll take 2 hours and start talking about it. Also on a mailing list, but I think it helps having some face-to-face interaction about this as well, and talk about it and think about the future of Debian on a regular basis. So yeah, on that note, if you have any questions, make sure you have a mic, or if you have comments, and yeah, let's see if there's anything someone wants to talk about.
Okay, we'll take questions now. Does anyone have any questions, comments to make?
Do we have some reverse engineers in reverse engineers here who are working on firmware already, or we haven't them yet?
In Debian, I think there are some people who do reverse engineering, but formally or in some planned capacity within Debian, no, not at the moment.
So what if when we just ask some universities who are doing reverse engineering, such as AHV, my university, we are doing some kinds of reverse engineering for firmware for microcontrollers. So maybe we can get in touch, maybe?
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah. Yeah, any university, if someone from university is doing something similar and listening in, please get in touch. It would be nice if we can organize something.
Any more questions?
In the last DPL election, someone also mentioned the idea of doing like paid internships for university students. That might also be a good idea, not for just for firmware, but for other things in Debian that also get stuck, that no one gets time to look into. At least, at least they get to do their internship, and we get something out of it as well. And who knows, maybe they could even become a Debian developer if they get involved in the community. So, also something we should maybe consider at some point.
Just the main issue with internships is getting from the prototype that you were able to build during the internship to production. And this is something that we have a hard time doing already with all the internship programs that we participate in.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Maybe putting some effort in that would be useful as well.
Cool.
So to pick up on the other side of reverse engineering, should Debian advertise supported system configurations more, and maybe even try to get on board with developing free hardware as something that we officially support, whatever that means?
I think so, yes. Ideally, that should be on a download page so that you can check at that point whether your hardware is supported, but also many people don't know which hardware they have. So I was thinking of creating a little utility that could be part of Debian Live, or maybe a small stub that netboots the same code over the network, where you can kind of boot a Debian Live system that does some form of hardware compatibility check, maybe you could take that to shops with you and boot it off a CD if you want to buy a laptop and get a report on the screen of what's inside and what's supported and what's not supported. So I think a combination of the problem is a list on a website is actually harder to maintain than a piece of software that checks that, just because there's so much variations and different hardware out there. But yeah, I think hardware compatibility list is a good idea. I just don't know how or who will maintain it, because that seems to be the biggest issue when it comes to those things. So if someone wants to volunteer for that or get involved, that's also great, or wants to run that completely. But yeah, we should have that. It's just finding someone to do it. Maybe also, that could also maybe be something we can do for Google Summer of Code students to design and implement something like that, and maybe even partially maintain it. I don't know. But yeah, we need to figure something out.
So maybe somewhat related to that, what we've been discussing is maybe something like scoring system. So you basically you have a Wi-Fi card that uses a non-free firmware, which is like which you're able to detect, and then you kind of like classify systems from like 0 points, which means you need non-free firmware for every component, to up to 10 points, which means you need no non-free firmware at all, and then kind of like even recommend these systems that are more free than the other ones, instead of going like on the FSF side from either you're totally free or totally non-free.
Yeah.
That would probably help us to converge and also see these are the problem areas like Wi-Fi or whatever, and then invest in that areas more. And
Yeah, that's great. And also just knowing if it will work or not, in addition to that, is also useful.
So I'm asking myself, what is the policy for spending Debian money? Because if I remember correctly, we have quite a lot. And if we would do some kind of bug bounty program, would it be, in terms of policy for spending Debian money, would that be easily possible, or is this more complex?
So I really want to put together a nice policy for that covers how we spend money that we all can agree on. There is currently a wiki page of a policy, but it doesn't explain things like this. Basically, the money is collectively all of ours, so as long as the majority of Debian is happy with how we implement a spending policy, it's fine. There's little, there are some restraints on how we can spend money, how we work with our TOs. Like, we can't donate our money to rich people. It has to be part of. It has to be within the scopes of inside the scope of a project. So stuff like bug bounties should be fine, but I'd like to explicitly list things like that. Like, what if a Debian developer says they want, I don't know, €1,000 to spend a month focusing on one thing and take, unpaid off of work? Should we say yes to that or no? I'm not 100% sure, but it would be nice if we as a project can agree to a bunch of stuff so that we can easier say yes or no. Or ideally not even need DPL approval, so that if we have a checklist that the treasurer team say, okay, this confirms to all our spending policies, it's approved automatically, then that might even make it easier for people to spend money and stuff. But I think we should really use, if someone's willing to do work to improve stuff like firmware, we should spend that money. We have enough money in Debian to pay for the next 5 years worth of DebConf, mini-debconf, hardware, hosting, without getting any sponsors for that period. So we have enough headroom to spend some money and still have enough for if things go bad. So yeah, I agree that we should spend money on stuff like that.
Is there any time plan for a GR or something for this kind of policy change?
I don't think at the moment the DPL can approve basically anything on a technical level. So I think in the meantime, if you'd ask me, if you send a request for something like this, it would get approved at the moment. But I would like to have something more solid that we've agreed to, because I don't want to make a decision and be unsure about it, and then people in the project are unhappy with it, because ultimately, collectively, we need to be somewhat in agreement of how we spend money. I think my gut feeling is that everyone is fine with us spending money on things like firmware, but it would be nice to get some confirmation of that.
Thanks.
think we're out of time as well.
I guess we have time for one more question if there's one, or comment.
Maybe one remark regarding thinking about spending engineering effort on reverse engineering is the consideration of the lifetime of the hardware. You know that this takes a long time to reverse engineer something, so if you're investing it on something like a consumer hardware, which is going to die the other year, without your control, without your knowledge even, that can be wasted effort. That would be painful. I mean, from my recent experience to buy a Linux-supported Wi-Fi stick, I ended up with one, but not with the one I wanted, because it is very, very hard to find out what you actually get on this consumer market. While it's a little bit more realistic on something which is designed to live a little bit longer because it's targeting different market spaces. So this is something to consider on that. I mean, if you look at how, for example, how the Mali GPU was reverse engineered, this is silicon which is supposed to live very long. So the investment there was well invested in the end because the hardware still is there, and it influenced a lot. I mean, I see it now coming from the industrial market that there is movement in the space regarding open source support for GPUs in embedded, which used to be quite crazy a couple of years ago. But still, as you mentioned, there's a way to go. You have to look into which fight to take there. So I really appreciate this, but you know, you can fight up some stuff and then you find out that, great, now I understand it, but it's gone.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's true. Maybe over time we can have several projects to design a free Wi-Fi card, even if you have to plug it in via your USB port to be able to use it. But yeah, I think things will escalate a lot in the engineering space because you look at what home hackers are doing these days. It's insane. Like people build their own PC motherboards from scratch now, and this was unthinkable a few years ago of a home engineer being able to do that. And before we know it, people are building their own silicon, not their own silicon at home, but designing it and getting it printed at places. So, you know, what will happen in 5, 10, 15 years from now? Maybe there'll be a big open source GPU project that where engineers get together and build a hobbyist GPU that will probably even work better for some university platforms because of that than the commercial stuff. Anything can change and happen, and I think we need to be kind of ready for success because the way people work is they plan for failure so much they forget like what are we actually going to do if things work out for us and come together in the way that we wanted to. And it might be that the industry evolves and matures in our favor, and we should be somewhat ready for that as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.